All right. Hello. Welcome to our lunch study break. It is Wednesday, February 9th, 2022, and we are going to be picking up on our conversation last week and in recent weeks. And one of the, recurring issues that has been coming up throughout our world in the midst of our pandemic are questions of suffering. Illnesses, sicknesses, why do these things happen? What does it mean? How do we understand God? How do we understand the fact that a lot of us are trying to live a life of virtue and morality, and yet bad things happen to us? And so what I'm going to do today, and I think I can do it in an hour, but we'll find out if I can. I'm going to discuss what my professor, Rabbi Neil Gilman, called the most sold book written by a rabbi ever, which is Rabbi Harold Kushner's book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, especially during our current time. That is a good thing to consider. Lisa tells me that it's even in the Daf Yomi page for today in the Masechet. What Masechet are you in, Lisa?
Yeah, Moed Katan, 28.
And Moed Katan. So that comes up on the Daf Yomi today. It comes up in our discussions. And what interests me about this book, obviously, just let me give a little preface and then we'll get right into it. What interests me this book is obviously the theology is fascinating to me, how Rabbi Kushner goes about addressing this question of when bad things happen to good people. The title, I think, very smart title. I think so many books succeed or fail based upon their titles. He had an excellent title, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And also what's interesting to me is when he wrote it, it's in the early 80s. Seems to be right around the time that baby boomer generation is beginning to have families. And he shares a very personal story of his own that lays the foundation for this book. And what interests me is the fact that this was so resonant, that this spoke to a time and place in the 1980s American Jewry in a very profound way. And so as we hear Rabbi Kushner, obviously we'll think about whether or not we agree with his approach here, whether we agree with his theology, because that's certainly what we do here in this class, but also think about why do you think this was resonant to the extent that it was during the time it came out? Why was it such a phenomenon and such a hit? Okay, so let me begin. I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to try to do this on a full screen there. Does that work? People see that? All right, good. All right, so we're going to do this and we'll see if I can make this work. All right, let me, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, Rabbi Harold S. Kushner. And let me just begin with why he wrote the book. And if at any point you want to stop me and ask a question, I would appreciate, feel free to do that. I'm just going to stand up for one moment because I created a little crib sheet for myself to help take us through this book in the appropriate time period. And I want to make sure I have my crib sheet with me here. So let's begin with why Rabbi Kushner wrote this book and sort of setting the stage for it. So he begins by saying that, yes, Marv, look at that. I didn't even get a word in, Marv. Go right ahead.
I don't know if there's a picture of his son in the book, but his son had progeria. And I think if you saw a picture of a child with progeria, it would make this book even, make the rabbi's comments even more understandable.
All right, so
it's the progeria, P-R-O-G-E-R.
I got it. I will, thank you. I will share that. So let me explain how we get to progeria first, and then I will show some pictures. So he says it's not an abstract book about God and theology. He's not going to use any big words or any clever ideas, but rather this is a very personal book written by someone who believes in God and in the goodness of the world, someone who has spent most of his life trying to help other people believe. So he writes, our son Aaron had just passed his 3rd birthday when our daughter Ariel was born. Aaron was a bright and happy child who before the age of 2 could identify a dozen varieties of dinosaurs and could patiently explain to an adult that dinosaurs were extinct. My wife and I had been concerned about his health from the time he stopped gaining weight at the age of 8 months and from the time his hair started falling out after he turned 1 year old. Prominent doctors had seen him, had attached complicated names to his condition, and had assured us that he would grow to be very short, but would be normal in all other ways. Just before our daughter's birth, we moved to a suburb of Boston. We discovered that the local pediatrician was doing research on problems in children's growth, and we introduced him to Aaron. 2 months later, the day our daughter was born, he visited my wife in the hospital, and he told us our son's condition was called progeria, rapid aging. He went on to say that Aaron would never grow much beyond 3 feet in height. He would have no hair on his head or body. He would look like a little old man when he was still a child, and he would die in his early teens. So just as Marv says, if you want, here is a search of progeria. How does one handle news like that? I was a young, inexperienced rabbi, not as familiar with the process of grief as I would later come to be, and I was mostly felt that a day was a deep, aching sense of unfairness. It didn't make sense. I had been a good person. I had tried to do what was right in the sight of God. More than that, I was living a more religiously committed life than most people I knew, people who had large, healthy families. I believed I was following God's ways and doing his work. How could this be happening to my family? If God existed, if he was minimally fair, let alone loving and forgiving, how could he do this to me? And even if I could persuade myself that I deserved this punishment for some sin of neglect or pride, on what grounds did Aaron have to suffer? He was an innocent child, a happy, outgoing 3-year-old. Why should he have to suffer physical and psychological pain every day of his life?
A child that had progeria, which is, oh my gosh.
So he says, like most people, my wife had grown up with an image of God as an all-white, all-powerful parent figure who would treat us as our earthly parents did, or even better. He would reward us if we got out of line. He would discipline us reluctantly but firmly. Like most people, he says, I was aware of the human tragedies that darkened the landscape, the young people who died in car crashes. But that awareness, he says, never drove me to wonder about God's justice. Then came the day in the hospital when the doctor told us about Aaron and explained what progeria meant. It contradicted everything that I had been taught. I could only repeat over and over again in my mind, this can't be happening. This is not how the world is supposed to work. All right, so I'm going to move on a little bit, and I will be skipping through so that we can cover the book, and I apologize because so much of this is very moving. But he says, I did not set out to write a book that would defend or explain God. There is no need to duplicate the many treatises already on the shelves, and even if there were, I am not a formally trained philosopher. I'm a fundamentally religious man who has been hurt by life, and I wanted to write a book that could be given to the person who has been hurt by life, by death, by illness, by injury, by rejection, or by disappointment. What can God mean to such a person? Where can he turn for strength? If you are such a person, if you want to believe in God's goodness and fairness, but find it hard because of the things that have happened to you and the people you care about, and if this book helps you, then I will have succeeded in distilling some blessing out of Aaron's pain and tears. Okay, so that is the introduction and the why he wrote the book. Ben,
Well, it's impossible not to sympathize, right, with with the rabbi and his predicament and his family's sort of tragedy. But I do think it's interesting that we all seem to be okay when suffering is something that happens to other people. He must have been aware that suffering was something that happened to other people, and only had a sort of crisis in faith when it happened to him. So I don't know, why that needs to be true, and I kind of wish it weren't.
All right. So why is it that these instances we can see happen to around us, but we can remain somehow anesthetized to the pain that happens to other people, but when it happens to us, it blows our world apart. And that just might be the nature of human existence itself. And Ben is pointing that out, and that is perhaps a truism and annoying at the same time. Let's go back here. All right, so he's gonna get right into it, Ben. He says there is only one question which really matters. Why do bad things happen to good people? He says all other theological conversation is intellectually diverting, somewhat like doing the crossword puzzle in the Sunday paper and feeling very satisfied when you have made the words fit, but ultimately without the capacity to reach people where they really care. Virtually every meaningful conversation I have ever had with people on the subject of God and religion has either started with this question or gotten around to it before long. Not only the troubled man or woman who has just come from a discouraging diagnosis, but the college student who has told me that there is no God, or the total stranger who comes up to me at a party just when I am ready to ask the hostess for my coat and says, "I hear you're a rabbi. How can you believe that?" All of them have one thing in common. They are all troubled by the unfair distribution of suffering in the world. All right, so that is going to be Rabbi Kushner's frame, is that basically what disturbs people to its greatest extent is the unfair distribution of suffering in the world. And pretty much every religious conversation he has revolves around that. All right, so I'm going to move forward to him a little bit. And he talks a little bit about being a rabbi for a congregation of 600 families. And I visit them in the hospital. I officiate at their funerals. I try to help them through their pain of their divorces. I sit and listen to them pour out their stories. And I find it very hard to tell them that life is fair, that God gives people what they deserve and need. Time after time, I have seen families and even whole communities unite in prayer for the recovery of the sick person, only to have their hopes and prayers mocked. I have seen the wrong people get sick, the wrong people hurt, and the wrong people die. All right, so he goes on here and talks about when he was a young rabbi just starting out in his profession, he was called upon to help a family through an unexpected tragedy. This middle-aged couple had a daughter, a bright 19-year-old girl who was in her freshman year out of state college. One morning, they received a phone call from the university infirmary. "We have some bad news for you. Your daughter collapsed. It seems a blood vessel burst in her brain and she died before we could do anything for her. We're terribly sorry." Stunned, the parents asked a neighbor to come in to help them decide what to do next. The neighbor notified the synagogue, and I went over the same day. I entered their home feeling very inadequate, not knowing any words that could ease their pain. I anticipated anger, shock, and grief, but I did not expect to hear the first words they said to me, which was, "You know, Rabbi, we didn't fast last Yom Kippur." Why did they say that? Why did they assume that they were somehow responsible for this tragedy? Who taught them to believe in a God who would strike down an attractive, gifted young woman without warning? One of the ways that people have tried to make sense of the world's suffering is by assuming we deserve what we get. He quotes here from Isaiah, tell the righteous it will be well with them, from the book of Genesis. Judah's firstborn was wicked and the Lord slew him, from Proverbs. No ill before the righteous, from the book of Job. What innocent was ever published? Talks about this notion of guilt. And he says this couple sat there angry at God for having exacted his pound of flesh so strictly, but afraid to admit their anger for fear he would punish them again. Life had hurt them and religion could not comfort them. Religion was making them feel worse. So he writes here at the end of this, and he goes through some of the Psalms. He writes, I find I cannot share the optimism of the psalmists that the righteous in the long run will flourish like the palm tree and give testimony to God's uprightness. Often the victims of misfortune try to console themselves with the idea that God has his reasons for making these happen, but this doesn't satisfy him. So he says, my religious commitment to the supreme value of an individual life makes it hard for me to accept an answer that is not scandalized by an innocent person's pain, that condones human pain because it supposedly contributes to an overall work of aesthetic value. If a human artist or employer made children suffer so that something immensely impressive or valuable could come to pass, we would put him in prison. Why then should we excuse God for causing such undeserved pain, no matter how wonderful the result will be? And he quotes Rabbi Soloveitchik, one of the great Orthodox teachers. Suffering comes to ennoble man, to purge his thoughts of pride and superficiality, to expand his horizons. In sum, the purpose of suffering is to repair that which is faulty in a man's personality. So basically, the problem with this line of thinking for Rabbi Kushner is that it isn't really meant to help the sufferer or to explain his suffering. It is meant primarily to defend God, to use words and ideas to transform bad into good and pain into privilege. Such answers are thought up by people who believe very strongly that God is a loving parent who controls everything. I would find it easier to believe that I experienced tragedy and suffering in order to repair that which is faulty in my personality if there were some clear connection between the fault and the punishment. So basically, he goes through a little bit. I'm trying to move quickly because I do want to get through the book. But if he says, if we don't accept this idea as a test, if we're not comforted by that, and then all the responses, he says, to the tragedy, which we have considered, have had one thing in common. They assume that God is the cause of our suffering. If you look at God testing us, or if you look at us carrying that suffering, or if you look at this being for some sort of aesthetic or some good that God is creating, all of them assume, according to Rabbi Kushner, that God would want us to suffer, that it is for our own good, it is a punishment we deserve. Many of the answers were sensitive and imaginative, but he says none were totally satisfying. He says there might be another approach. Maybe God does not cause our suffering. This is his pivot from all of the earlier stories that I zipped through, from the Talmud, from the Psalms, from the biblical idea of reward and punishment. Rabbi Kushner says maybe there's another approach. Maybe God doesn't cause our suffering. Maybe it happens for some other reason other than the will of God. Could it be that God does not cause the bad things that happen to us? Could it be God doesn't decide which families give birth to handicapped children? The most profound and complete consideration of the suffering, he says at the bottom, comes from the book of Job. And we're going to pause there for a little bit. But that is a very quick way of me going through his setup for the book, which is the setup of the situation with his son, followed by what do people normally say to people in circumstances like this? well, you're being tested, or it's for a reason, or we don't know what God wants. And Rabbi Kushner says all of those reasons do nothing for the person in pain. They're just trying to protect God. And so he rejects that. And he is going to put forward a theological perspective that says basically the problem of being angry at God or upset at God is we're giving God too much power here. And if we pull back, and if God isn't that powerful, then maybe we can come to a different relationship with God. Okay, Steve, and then Susan.
Yes, this gets back to what I've mentioned before in our Torah study, that whenever people die of plague in the Torah, there's the assumption that they've died because they've sinned and are being punished by God. And you see that over and over again. And I can see how people then believe that if bad things happen, it's because they're being punished by God. And I think we need to look at maybe the Torah a little bit differently.
Yeah, absolutely. That story of the family that loses their 19-year-old child and thinks it's because they didn't fast on Yom Kippur is just horrific. It's just awful to hear that. Susan.
Yeah, my mother, who is frum, as was I as a child, Gamza Latova for everything, anything bad. You're in a horrible car accident, Gamza Latova, and she would always find something good, but that's not what I raised my hand about. Lisa brought up the daf for today, and I write haiku every day on whatever the daf is, but my fourth haiku was from the sages. Length of life, children, and sustenance all depend on fate, not merit. So they were quite wise, these guys. I mean, that's right from the rabbis. And I thought that was interesting. And it's kind of in sync with Job as well,
Yeah, let me hold on to your questions, Jeff and Mar, for 1 second, because the very next chapter that I'm going to do quickly is not the Job chapter, because I think we know the story of Job. Basically, Job complains that his punishment is unfair, and God says, who the heck are you? You weren't there when I created the world, so be quiet. That's sort of the story of Job. But there's something that right about this fate that comes from the daf today that I want to get to. So if you just give me one moment here, says, what makes bad luck happen? So the question comes, if the bad things that happen to us are the result of bad luck and not the will of God, a woman asked him, what makes bad luck happen? I was stumped for an answer, Rabbi Kushner says. My instinctive response was that nothing makes bad luck happen. It just happens. But I suspected there might be more to it than that. And he asks, can you accept the idea that some things happen for no reason? That there is randomness in the universe? Some people cannot handle that idea. They look for connections, right? Striving desperately to make sense of all that happens. I mean, look at all the conspiracy theorists out there. Most of them are people who just assume that there's meaning in a total random environment and can concoct any scenario because there is this pull to have some sort of meaning that makes sense of the world. Rabbi Kushner says some people will find the hand of God behind everything that happens. But he wants to ask you again, is there always a reason? Or do some things just happen at random for no cause? And then he shares the story of the creation. And we've talked about this previously, this idea that God doesn't create out of nothing, but rather what creation means is not to make something out of nothing, but to make order out of chaos. And so God comes into this chaotic world and separates out the land from the sea, the sky from the earth, and gives an opportunity in the midst of this chaos to allow for there to be order to exist. All right, so that's just a theological background a little bit on randomness and chaos. How can we accept randomness and chaos in our world? Well, it's not on God. When God created the world was totally quantum and chaotic and random and No past, no future. I mean, just think about what scientists have told us exists at the quantum realm. It's just chaos. No life could exist there. That's the metaphor for what the universe looked like. And in the midst of that quantum realm, God comes in with whatever powers God has to separate out in the midst of chaos distinctions, separating light from darkness, land from sea, earth from sky, so that we can, live 120 years, God willing, and make this land holy, right? That's an alternative theological framework for a God who just in the beginning creates the heaven and the earth, and everything is owed to God's creation. That is Kushner's idea. It is theologically troublesome for a traditionalist. Okay, Jeff, and then Marv.
Thanks, Rabbi. I have a lot of problems with Kushner, not all of which you have to hear today.
Thank you for that, Jeff.
Well, of all the rabbis I've complained to you about, Kushner is problematic. I have actually said this a number of times over the last couple of years that we've all been sequestered. I have said that your entire profession, the rabbinic profession across the board, from the liberal modern Orthodox on to the left, has been infected with Harold Kushnerism. Everyone has adopted, to one extent or another, this idea that God is blameless. This was a very easy theology for Kushner to develop. He fell into it naturally. And I know he had a horrible tragedy with his child. I know that. In fact, my aunt and uncle were among the founding members of his synagogue here in Natick. I grew up in Framingham. But his final word has always been, God can't or won't intervene, and he won't circumvent randomness, including genetic randomness. But the thing is, he was surrounded by loving family, friends, community. Everyone helped him. Everyone was there for him. And I started to say, his final word has always been, God can't circumvent the randomness, but he can give us friends, family, community to help us to bear it and to get through it, whatever we have to get through. But what about those of us who don't have community? I'm not here 3,000 miles away every week for my health. I don't have community here because as I've told you, Boston doesn't have much by way of Jewish community. And or what if community, what if family themselves are the source of the suffering? And we're faced with an impotent God who just wrings his hands and says, geez, I'm so sorry. I'd like to help you, but I can't. Back in the early 90s.
Can I stop you? That's very profound. Hold on for a second.
I'm almost done.
That was just very profound. I wanted to process that. Yeah.
Back in the early 90s, Hans Kung, a Catholic theologian, for those who don't know, wrote a book in which, I forget what the name of the book, but he did mention this toward the end. And I don't think he mentioned Kushner by name, but he said like an American rabbi. And he mentioned, there's this American rabbi who says, yada, 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 says, this is not an authentically biblical view of God. And I would agree with that. And I will just throw one more thing in. I have no use for a God who can't intervene. Then he may as well not exist at all. I don't have a faculty for connecting to God or having a relationship with it. So there's no unio.
He's going to address that. But I just for a second, we're going to get to that. Hopefully, if we have time.
But I just want to say one more thing. Let me just finish.
Yes.
I'm done. I don't really see. For me, it must be transactional. And if God says I can't or won't intervene, then I don't understand why we've spent the last 3
months. Then what's the point of the covenant? The covenant's got to be two ways. No. I understand you, Jeff. The point is you're saying the covenant has to be two ways, and you're saying this theology is not Bible-based.
No.
And both of those, I think, are legitimate points. But I even think even more legitimate, and a more legitimate critique, which I was actually thinking about in recent weeks, which is the failure of just sort of whole-scale rabbinism and over the past generation. I think it does have to do with privilege. That I have been thinking about that. And I've been thinking that I'm saying this on a recorded conversation, Gewalt, but I do think so many of our leaders and our rabbis come from ultimately privileged places and respond from those positions of comfort. Yep. And I think that comes out in this theology. I don't don't know Harold Kushner, so I can't speak to his circumstance. But I think that is a question, and we are often led in our, well, this is a class issue I'm making. We're often led in our rabbis who come from a different class, and I think that sometimes creates problems. I said that out loud. Marv.
You know, in the creation story, it doesn't take too many pages to get to the episode of Cain and Abel. So excuse me. So, I mean, look at Abel, gave a prized sacrifice, and then he's dead. And what is Abel? Abel is Avel. What is Avel? Avel is futile, you know, from Ecclesiastes, futility. So the answer to these questions are futile. There's no answer to these questions.
That's right. And yet they bother us in our soul.
Yes.
And yes, they sting with us and they keep us awake in the middle of the night. So that's correct. There is no answers, and Judaism promises no answers. We just promise a continuation of the dialogue. And so here's a couple of questions that Rabbi Kushner wants to ask us. Hold on, let me enter the full screen here. Let us suppose, for the purpose of argument, that God was determined not to let anything bad happen to a good and pious person. If Oswald shoots at the president, no matter how careful he aims, God will make the bullet miss. If a wing falls off Air Force, I don't know what's with the presidential things. That's the time it's written. If a wing falls off Air Force One, God will make it land safely. Would this be a better world if certain people were immune to the laws of nature because God favored them while the rest of us had to fend for ourselves? I mean, that's, by the way, very biblical. By the way, there is a lot of biblical that says that we are a special people who have a special laws and the rest of the world has to fend for themselves, but that's okay. Let us suppose again, for the purposes of argument, that I was one of those righteous people to whom God would not let anything bad happen because I was an observant, charitable person. What would that mean? Would I be able to go out shirtless in cold weather and not get sick? Could I cross the street against the lights in the face of heavy traffic and not be injured? Could I jump out of a high window and not hurt myself? A world in which good people suffer from the same natural dangers that others do, a world in which good people suffer from the same natural dangers that others do causes problems. But a world in which good people were immune to those problems would cause even more problems. And so he says, I believe that these calamities are all acts of nature and that there is no moral reason that some people die in earthquakes and some people live and some people die from natural disasters and some people don't. He asks here, if God was designing a world for our maximum benefit, why could he not create unchanging laws of nature which would not do harm to any of us, good or bad? Why do we feel pain? What's the benefit of pain? He says, pain is the price we pay for all being alive. He asks, why did God create a world in which there is sickness and disease? A very relevant question for us. He says, I don't know why people get sick, sometimes fatally. I know that sicknesses are caused by germs and viruses, or at least I take that on faith, never having seen a germ or a virus. I suspect that people get sick when they are depressed, when they feel rejected and can't look forward to the immediate future. I know that people recover from illnesses far faster when they know that people care about them, back to Jeff's point. But I don't have a good answer to the question of why our bodies had to be made vulnerable to germs and viruses and malignant tumors in the first place. I understand that the cells of which our bodies are made are constantly dying and being replaced. So he goes on and says, I have no satisfying answers to these questions of cancer and kidney failure and blindness. The best answer I know is the reminder that man today is only the latest stage in a long, slow, evolutionary process. Again, that's not really a biblical perspective. Once upon a time, the only things that were alive were plants, and then came man. And he says that we are different from animals. And that is what is going to be his next section, which is to say that we understand the good and the bad that animals don't. Animals are programmed, but we as human beings, because of the freedom given to us by God, have the ability to choose in a way animals don't. He says sex here is so simple and straightforward for animals and yet so painful for the rest of us because we are in the realm of the world of good and evil. And he says, this is what it means to be human, created in the image of God. It means being free to make choices instead of doing whatever our instincts would tell us. So why then do bad things happen to good people? One reason is that our being human leaves us free to hurt each other, and God can't stop us without taking away the freedom that makes us human. Pause there. Thoughts, responses. Don.
Yeah, I just think that I don't think God didn't create a world of suffering and sickness. He created the garden, and there was no suffering and no sickness in the garden. So just that. So to blame God for sickness and suffering, I don't know. He didn't do it. I don't know how it got done or what happened, but
But wait, are you? But I'm surprised you to say that. I would have thought that you would be bothered by Harold Kushner's just based upon a couple of years of us talking. I would have thought that you would be bothered by God not having the supreme power over sort of fate and everything. I thought that might clash with your worldview. Am I right?
well, God creates the garden, and yeah, will we go out? That's a good point. I don't know. That's a good. I'll have to think about that one.
Sorry, I apologize.
No,
no, that's why you come here, Don.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I really do.
Other thoughts, other ideas. Anybody else want to come in here? Go right ahead, Susan.
I think about the Buddha story about a woman whose child dies and she's won't let go of the child and goes to the Buddha and says, please bring my child back to life. And he says, okay, just bring me a mustard seed from a household that has not seen death.
Yes.
And she goes door to door to door and desperately, and everyone's had death in their household, and then she gets it. So for people like me and people in the humanist Jewish movement, there's no looking to God. It's just knowing that we all suffer and all we can do is help each other and understand that that is part of life,
So let me ask you, as a theist, as someone who believes, does the sort of randomness, does the meaninglessness of a universe without a creator get to you? Does it?
It's really interesting that you asked that, because I know Sherwin Wine, of blessed memory, called me after I got hit by a car a number of years ago, and I was extremely in bad shape and took a long time to heal. And he said, see, the world is random. And I disagreed with him because no, people were wonderful and helped. And so I look more like the way Viktor Frankl looks at things. It's more existential. We create meaning in our lives, in our circumstances. At the same time, I know that the congregation I used to lead of humanists, many of whom were survivors, some who had had faith before their families were wiped out, and they could not be part of a community that prayed to a God that they were, some people were angry at this God. Some people thought, no, an all-powerful God who has no power, why would you pray to that person, that being?
Right, of course.
So for many people in my movement, the issue of God just is irrelevant. It's you as an individual find meaning in your suffering, and you have compassion for other people. I mean, for me,
That really leaves you on your own, though, right? You really, okay.
I taught my children this as well. When something bad happens, it gives you this great empathy, as Ben was saying, how hard it is to have empathy, that it's only when it happens to you that you really have it. You take that every time you suffer, you take that and you think, oh, that's it. You know, like I don't get angry very often.
Beautiful.
But every now and then, if I get angry, I think, oh, that's what it's like. You know, that's why you might tend to lash out, you know, or pain. When I get hit by the car, I disagreed with Sherwin Wine. It was like, well, now I know what pain is. I didn't know what pain was before. I mean, even in childbirth, it's nothing compared to having 2 broken legs. And so I think that's enough. For me, that's enough. And, you know, the issue of God and the power of God, you know, to intervene in the world is just not really something that enters my mind very often.
What a blessing it is to have you part of this conversation. Even though obviously we come from different theological perspectives, I just love the Torah. And I find myself really enriched by hearing your Torah and having you share with it. And also enriched by knowing that Rabbi Sherwin Wine was a terrible pastor and had awful bedside manner. So, I mean, that also gives me great comfort. That's a joke. That was a joke.
He did a great funeral.
That was a joke.
Anyway,
you broke your legs. See, the world is random.
I appreciate being here and hearing your point of view and other people in your community. So
yeah, thank you, Susan. Ben.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, I take great comfort in this sort of randomness of the universe.
Oh, you take comfort in chaos. That's odd.
Not chaos, but probability. Let us say, you know, it means that everything is going to happen to everybody sooner or later.
What about Einstein? God doesn't play dice with the universe, type of thing.
Well, it turns out he was wrong. You know, I mean, that was a rejection of quantum physics, and it turned out he was wrong. I mean, just on a purely scientific basis.
So what comforts you about randomness is the idea that we all have one chit that we throw in, but our chits aren't all weighted equally. Tell me.
Well, okay. So, that's the other part of what I wanted to say is that Kushner seems to understand suffering as something that happens to us, as if we have no agency. Suffering is something we experience internally, right? And the same thing can happen to 2 different people, and one may suffer horribly and the other one may not. And we do have some choice in that matter, right? We always have a choice as to how we're going to respond to things that happen.
Like the lottery deal, the lottery studies. They find people win the lottery, they come back to them 2 years later, they're equally as happy or equally as miserable as they were prior to winning the lottery.
Right. And of course, yes, I mean, there are some circumstances that are sort of objectively very, very tough, right? But you know, everybody suffers. I mean, you know, to Susan's point, everybody, right? You can't go anywhere. You can't find a household that has not suffers. That hasn't suffered. So I don't agree with Kushner's assumption that the distribution of suffering is unfair. It happens to all of us. You know, maybe it seems
okay. It seems unfair. I think from
that we should suffer at all.
From my vantage point, it seems unfair in the universe. It seems like there is an inequitable distribution of suffering from my vantage point.
Well, but you don't know, right?
That's correct. I do not know
how somebody else suffers.
Impossible.
Right? And you know, I would say, you know, to put it in a theological frame, right? That's where God is for us, right? Is in helping us in our responses to what happens, right? That's, you know, that's where God is, and that's what really. I mean, I'm with Hamlet. You know, nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. right?
Okay, so let me cut you off because there are a lot of other people who want to get in here, but that I believe is quoting from the late 20th century theologian Lenin, which is God is the concept by which we measure our pain, Ben, right? I think you might agree with him when he said that. Aubrey, you've been trying to get in here. You're unmuted, so you just go talk.
Well, I don't know what you guys are talking about. I've never understood the belief that there's got to be an explanation for everything. This is nature we're dealing with. And nature doesn't listen to anybody, doesn't control anybody. It is what it is. And so if you want to believe in God, you want to believe in the good God, etc., go ahead and believe it. It doesn't prove anything. And
all right, so it's just that's right. So you're just dealing with different people's emotional, theological, philosophical ways to react to things, and you seem very much in line with where Ben is coming from. Nature is cold, and basically religion is there to help us respond to the coldness of nature, which is very much in line with what Ben is saying. I want to move to Marcia and Dale, and then I'm going to finish the book. Marcia.
I read this When Bad Things Happen to Good People when I was an ICU nurse. And we lose a lot of people in ICUs. I mean, you don't get into the ICU unless you're close to death. And not all those people were old. And when we get some young people, it was just heartbreaking. And then the whole AIDS epidemic and all those, they were young guys, that were just dropping like flies back then, in the 1980s before all these medicines. And I found this book very comforting, actually, just sort of something to hold on to. And theologically, maybe it doesn't meet the needs of some people, but I think religion gives a framework from which community can be created. And Judaism gives one the calendar, which gives one rituals to move yourself through life and to help create community. And that's irrespective of whether bad things are happening to you or not, frankly. It's a comfort to have this community and these rituals to fortify ourselves when bad things happen, whether we believe in God or not, frankly.
So it's interesting. You're definitely, thank you, Marcia, really powerful. And I had no doubt that it was meaningful working in an ICU. And it's when you're in an ICU, theology is the last thing anybody wants to hear. Thank you for that. Dale.
Oh, yes. I don't agree with Ben. I think it's obvious that the that suffering is unequally distributed. We all have suffering, but some people suffer more than others. And it's true that we have some degree of agency, but we don't have total agency. And the clearest evidence for that is people who are clinically depressed. They don't want to be depressed. If they had agency, they wouldn't be depressed.
I think that is a good reply to Ben's argument, and I think there are people who are born with chemical imbalances, with unfortunate nature and nurture situations in which rising above that to choose not to be self-destructive is Herculean. Almost takes a godlike effort in some ways. So I definitely hear that. I hear that concern and that response. Let me go. We've got 10 minutes left. Let's get to the final chapter here where it all happens. What good then is religion? All right, that's pretty much where we're going. In this sense, I have been writing this book for 15 years. From the day I heard the word progeria and was told what it meant, I knew that one day I would have to face Aaron's declining and dying. And I knew that after he died, I would feel the need to write a book, sharing with others the story of how we managed to go on believing in God and in a world after we had been hurt. I didn't know what to call the book, and I wasn't totally sure what I would say, but I knew that the page after the title page would carry a dedication to Aaron, I could visualize the dedication to him, and under it in my mind's eye, I could see the quotation from the Bible, Absalom, my son, would that I had died instead of you. Then one day, a year and a half after Aaron's death, I realized that I was visualizing that page differently in my imagination. Instead of the passage in which David wishes he was dead and his son alive, I saw in my mind's eye the words of David after the death of the earlier child, and the passage I've in fact used in my dedication. It comes from 2 Samuel. When David saw the servants whispering, he said to them, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." And David rose and washed and changed his clothing and asked that food be set before him, and he ate. The servants said to him, "What is it that you are doing? You fasted and wept for the child when he was still alive, and now that he is dead, you get up and eat." And David said, "While the child was yet alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether the Lord will be gracious to me and the child will live. But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me." So Rabbi Kushner says, now realizing that he had gone beyond self-pity to the point of facing and accepting his son's death. And so this had to be a book that would affirm life. It would have to say that no one ever promised us a life free from pain and disappointment. That most anyone promised us was that we would not be alone in our pain, and that we would be able to draw upon a source outside of ourselves for strength and courage we would need to survive life's tragedy and unfairness. So he goes on here. He says, this is the theological part. I believe in God, but I do not believe the same things about God that I did years ago when I was growing up or when I was a theology student. I recognize God's limitations. He is limited in what God can do by laws and nature, limited by laws and nature, and by the evolution of human nature and human moral freedom. I no longer hold God responsible for illnesses or accidents and natural disasters because I realize that I gain little and I lose so much when I blame God for those things. I can worship a God who hates suffering, but cannot eliminate it more easily than I can worship a God who chooses to make children suffer and die for whatever exalted reason. Some years ago, when the death of God theology was a fad, I remember seeing a bumper sticker that read, "My God is not dead. Sorry about yours." I guess my bumper sticker would read, "My God is not cruel. Sorry about yours." God does not cause our misfortunes. Some are caused by bad luck or bad people. The painful things that happen to us are not punishments for our misbehavior, nor are they in any way part of some grand design on God's part. So there's my question here. Does that mean that my suffering has no meaning? That is the most significant challenge that can be offered to the point of view I have been advocating in this book. We could bear nearly any pain or disappointment if we thought there was a purpose behind it. But even a lesser burden becomes too much for us if we feel it makes no sense. Patients in a VA hospital who have been seriously wounded in combat have an easier time adjusting to their injuries than patients with the exact same injury sustained while fooling around on a basketball court or in a swimming pool, because they can tell themselves that their suffering was at least for a good cause. He talks about the biblical story in chapter 32 of Exodus, how Moses, that's next week, when he came down from Mount Sinai and saw the Israelites worshiping the golden calf, he threw the tablets of the 10 Commandments, so they shattered. There's a Jewish legend that tells us that while Moses was climbing down the mountain with the 2 stone tablets on which God had written the 10 Commandments, he had no trouble carrying them, although they were large, heavy slabs of stone. After all, although they were heavy, they had been inscribed by God and were precious to him. But when Moses came upon the people dancing around the golden calf, the legend goes, the words disappeared from the stones and they were just blank stones again, and they became too heavy for him to hold on to. We could bear any burden if we thought there was a meaning to what we were doing. So have I made it harder for people to accept their illnesses, their misfortunes, their family tragedies by telling them that they weren't sent by God for some master plan? So let me suggest that bad things that happen to us in our lives do not have meaning when they happen to us. They do not happen for any good reason, which would cause us to accept them willingly, but we can give them meaning. We can redeem these tragedies from senselessness by imposing meaning on them. The question that we should be asking is not, why did this happen to me? Why did I deserve this? That is an unanswerable, pointless question. Better question would be, now that this has happened to me, what am I going to do about it? All right, so I'm just going to move here so we can just do a little bit of conversation before. He says here, God neither causes nor prevents tragedy, helps by inspiring people to help. As the Hasidic rabbi in the 19th century put it, human beings are God's language. God shows his human opposition to cancer and birth defects, not by eliminating them or making them only happen to bad people. He can't do that, but by summoning forth friends and neighbors to ease the burden and to fill the emptiness. Life is not fair, Rabbi Kushner begins to close with. The wrong people get sick, and the wrong people get robbed, and the wrong people get killed in wars and accidents. Some people seize life unfairness and decide there is no God. The world is nothing but chaos. Others see the same unfairness and ask, where do I get my sense of what is fair and what is unfair? Where do I get my sense of outrage and indignation? Don't I get these things from God? Our responding to life's unfairness with sympathy and with righteous indignation, God's compassion and God's anger working through us, may be the surest proof of God's reality. And so this is the ending and the final analysis. The question of why bad things happen to good people translates itself into some very different questions. No longer asking why something happened, but asking how we will respond and what we intend to do now that it has happened. Are you capable of forgiving and accepting and love a world which has disappointed you by not being perfect? Can you forgive its imperfections? Are you capable of forgiving and loving the people around you, even if they have hurt you and let you down by not being perfect? Can you forgive and love them because they aren't any perfect people around? Are you capable of forgiving and loving God, even when you have found out that God is not perfect, even when God has let you down?
No.
And if you can do these things, will you be able to recognize that the ability to forgive and the ability to love are the weapons God has given us to enable us to live fully, bravely, and meaningfully in a less than perfect world? I think of Aaron and all that his life taught me, and I realize how much I have lost and how much I have gained. Yesterday seems less painful, and I am not afraid of tomorrow. Okay, 12:59. I did get through the entire book in an hour. How about that? Don.
Yeah, maybe all the suffering that we go through is a gift from God, that if we do learn from the suffering, that we get back to the garden. So God is with us. He wants us back. She wants us back in the garden. It's very saddened, I think, if God can be sad. I don't know about that, but very saddened that we are gone. His children have left because we're going to go do something else and not stay there. And so she wants us back so bad that he can say, come on back, as he does, I think, but we don't do it. Or a lot of us don't do it. We can do it. We know a better way. And so he will give you the amount of suffering you need, what we call suffering, to slow you down, which is what suffering does. If you're in the hospital or something like that, or somebody dies, you got to go inward and take a look. And in that way, that's the gift of, we become then more righteous, so to speak. We become more kind and benevolent. And then we go back towards the garden, which is where I think we're all going to end up. We all started there. We're all going to end up there. And so the suffering is a gift from God. And I wouldn't tell that to the person who is in present time suffering. Okay, it's
yeah,
not.
no, I think if you look at the people who have great empathy, who have done great things. I think they're often the result of personal suffering, and the insights gained after those experiences. And as Rabbi Kushner says beautifully here and powerfully here, I would never, he said in a heartbeat, I would have my son back instead of writing this book, the most read book by a rabbi ever written. I'd do that in a heartbeat, but you know, that at least he can create something and maintain the memory of his son for a blessing. So yeah, Don, your theological position, I understand it. You see meaning in everything, and that is very powerful. Other thoughts here? Other people want to come in. Not everybody is going to agree with you, Don. I know not everybody does, but that's all right. Other people. Okay, so let me come back to my first question. Why was this so popular? If we don't want to, we got through the theology. We understand what Kushner is saying here. Why was this so popular? What made this, Lisa, what made this the book and the phenomenon it was?
In part, I'm thinking perhaps because that generation, the baby boomers whom you referenced, many were brought up thinking that life had to be fair, which is a luxury to grow up thinking that.
So this was speaking to a community of people that grew up thinking that there was a basic fairness in the universe. And then when that fairness got shattered, him creating a theology that can fill in the midst of their perceptions. Is that your idea?
I don't know about his answer, but perhaps the expectation that life would be fair.
Yeah, had been shattered, and he was speaking right into that. Yeah, I guess maybe, okay, good. Let's sort of keep going with that. I like that. Who are these people? Well, I don't know. I don't want to speak broadly about any generation, but, you know, this was the generation that, you know, had quite the awakening, the spiritual awakening in the late 60s, who had an idealization of the world that they could change, that they could live in. I mean, not everyone, but that was certainly a large part of that generational shift. And maybe that failed.
I think that many of us grew up in environments in which death was a stranger for many lucky people. Our parents' generation did not have that luxury.
Yeah.
Earlier generations lost siblings more often. More children died in childbirth or early. I just think it's different when you may not have had that experience.
You know, that's it. All right. I'm not saying I agree with you, but I'm going to try to articulate what you're saying, which is that this is a soft generation that hadn't really experienced trauma. And this is a book for a soft generation to be able to integrate a little bit of maturity into their lives. That's what I heard you say. Is that a fair characterization of what you said?
I will let you say that.
You know me. I have a natural habit of making
I don't want to
sound more starkly
but
for the purpose of creating dialogue.
I grew up after there was penicillin. My father's generation,
Oh my gosh. Yes. I think of my grandparents' generation and what they grew up in. I mean, my grandfather was blind. I was deaf in one ear. I mean, it was just another world to grow up.
That's really all I'm saying.
Yeah.
It was
and maybe 100 years ago, Harold Kushner, people would have been like, yeah, I'm not sure if this book is really has anything to say to me right now, right? You know, that could be the case too.
And if you read the Talmud, death is everywhere.
Well, death certainly was everywhere when the Talmud was being compiled. Jeff.
Yeah, I do think it was time and place. And in addition to what Lisa said, I'll throw in that he was speaking to a generation that had been exposed to Asian religions. They had already started to gain a foothold. And so, you know, he's trying to find some reason to give them to hold on to this. By the way, he was not the first one to come up with, and you're probably aware of this, he was not the first one to come up with this form of modified deism. Roland Gittleson, the rabbi of Temple Israel, here in Boston, in the 50s, I think he wrote a book in which he advocated the same form of deism. You know, it's not God's fault, he's not responsible, but he gives us community to help us. You know, he was lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time. And I don't know that he was even I think he was just trying to work through his son's death. And something else.
Clearly, no question.
And something else too, you know, in later years, he went on the speaking circuit, you know, and I think he made a few bucks off it. And he was I read a story, in fact, I heard him tell this story. A woman came up to him once and after a speaking gig and said, you know, I have a child who was born with this or that issue. And I have to think that God gave us this child because he knew we were the right parents for him. I can't think that it was just random. And Kushner told her, well, then, you know, don't read the book. Don't buy it. And if you have bought it, just give it away. Don't read it. It will only upset you, it's generous of him, I suppose. But, you know, at the same time, I'm thinking at that point, how much is he even still committed to this? You know, decades later.
All right, so that, you know, that's one take. I mean, I could view it favorably towards Kushner, where he realized his theology wasn't the right theology for that person at that time, and, you know, didn't feel the need to impose his thinking upon her. I mean, that's another way to look at it. Sandy Edwards, and then we'll end. Sandy, you've got the final question or the final comment.
Well, the comment I wanted to make, because I'm part of the baby boomer generation, is that I don't think we were soft. We had just gone through Vietnam. I mean, we were seeing friends go off to war. And I think by the 80s, we were starting to have our children and we were looking for meaning. We were looking for some way to explain what was going on with us, even if we didn't lose a child. I really think, and I have to say, I mean, this book spoke to me. So.
Oh, it spoke to everybody. Yeah, I mean,
visit. Thank you.
Oh no, thank you, Sandy. I think that's right. I think the early 80s are exactly when that baby boomer generation began to have families again. And you see that. I mean, you see there's a lot of different thinking on this. It's like the movies changed from Rosemary's Baby to all of a sudden Mr. Mom, right? It's like even Hollywood shifted it, you know? And so there is having children, having meaning, wanting to reconnect to a tradition of your grandparents or great-grandparents, but not buying the theology that you inherited because of your own personal experiences growing up in the 60s and seeing assassinations and horrors and wars, but yet wanting to reconnect, but yet wanting to, and hearing stories of the Shoah, but yet wanting to connect with Judaism and Rabbi Kushner providing a way to do it. So I like that. I think that's a great final thought. And thank you, Sandy. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this conversation. Next week, Alana Newhouse, the editor-in-chief of Tablet, is going to be joining us at noon. Come, bring your questions. She's going to be talking about an article which is on our website and in our Haluach called Everything is Broken. So I hope you join us for that discussion. And thank you. This was a really rich conversation, and I appreciate it. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So long. Thank you, Susan, for your great contributions.
Thanks.
Take care.